the many prime ministers of Queen Elizabeth II. Welcome to Mark and Peter. Here's a thought.
A colourful country. The backbone of Britain is a vibrant political blue, and the fringes are mellow yellow and green. The big red wall still remains sturdy and true, yet the head of state is a little grey queen. Clergyman Pete,
Yes,
here we are on
true.
the cusp of Queen Elizabeth II's 15th Prime Minister. Yes, folks,
Yes,
it'll either be
true.
Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss. I ask you, when you reflect back over the Queen's tenure to date, who would you say stands out as the best British Prime Minister?
Well, in my opinion, I mean, it's such an obvious choice, but I would say the first one. The first one was Winston Churchill. He was Prime Minister until 55. So he was in there as the Queen took up her position. And he overall was the best Prime Minister. No, he wasn't at his best at that point. That was to the end of his working life. He was getting on a bit, but he was overall, I think, the best Prime Minister. I mean, I would argue the best Prime Minister we've had.
Yes, possibly even, as some would say, the greatest Britain of all time.
I would argue that, yes. I agree with that assessment.
Yes,
yeah.
Argue and agree with it.
I would argue that is true. Now, what do you think? Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's true. I mean, if you look, and I know that obviously we can't ignore the fact that prior to Elizabeth II taking over as Queen and the head of state and becoming the monarch from 1952 onwards, Winston Churchill, without any doubt, politically had such influence across the nation on many fronts. And actually, the funny thing is that I think that there's a legacy also as we move forward in time, because he started to see a changing Britain. And when you think about those who took over, Anthony Eden was his successor, going into a very difficult time, of course, because we had the Suez Crisis. He didn't last very long, actually. He was only there from the 6th of April 1955 to the 9th of January 1957. It's very difficult.
Anthony Eden.
Yeah. Anthony Eden himself, yes, of course. But the problem is, it was always that horrible scenario for those of our veteran listeners who will know that, well, if they remember the times, is when will he go was the scenario. When will Winston Churchill go? And Eden was always like the man in waiting. But it's very difficult when you take over from somebody of his stature.
Well, yes, but you see, maybe he didn't want to go because he knew Anthony Eden, although actually physically taller, was not of the right stature.
Well, unfortunately, that is true, and it turned out to be the case.
But we saw something similar later prime ministers, still in Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. Tony Blair seemed to be hanging on to stop for Gordon Brown from actually taking over. And when he did take over, it was a total disaster. He was terrible. Yes. I would say worse than Anthony Eden in terms of his abilities.
Well, that's true. Although one thing that I would like to point out, and we think about the Queen's reign, lots of things have happened during her reign, and I'm going to come back to the point that although she thought she was Queen, the eighth one under her tenure probably thought she was Queen too.
Yes,
and we know
Margaret
who
Thatcher.
That might be. Yes. Margaret Thatcher. Now, let's just sort of dwell on that a little bit, because actually, ironically, Margaret Thatcher became the Conservative leader in 1975 and didn't actually become Prime Minister until the 4th of May 1979. Now, her reign through the 1980s up to the 28th of November 1990, my goodness, how have we seen the changes of time since then? But it was notorious that the two didn't see eye to eye. Now, I must admit that from my recollection of the times, whilst the Queen hasn't necessarily always come out in public about her political views, it was quite evident that there was a bit of friction between the two. This was often documented in the tabloids. And I wonder, when we sort of think about Margaret Thatcher's regime, let's just dwell on her. What's your thoughts on Margaret Thatcher as a Prime Minister?
Well, Margaret Thatcher was a very forceful personality, went through a good, I suppose, spin process. She created a good image for herself and used this to push through her policies with the public. And I didn't agree with her, I suppose, her basis for her policies, which, without going into it, a different political theory than one that I support. But I think I liked the fact that she was a strong personality. And in terms of foreign policy, I agree with a lot of what she did.
Yes.
And like to stand a firm stance on, for example, terrorism.
Yes.
So,
and Europe.
And indeed Europe, where she was very sceptical. I didn't agree with her on climate change and other policies that have become more important later. So, yes, there was friction between her and the Queen, but she was doing work that I think the Queen should have been doing, should have been taking more of a leadership role. The Queen has been nice, but largely absent during all of her reign. Well, and I know it's the constitutional position, but there's quite a lot of leeway in a constitutional position. She didn't need to be as silent and absent as she has been.
Well, I'll come on to the Queen's intervention, which is where I think personally that there should have been. But there's one individual who, when we talk about the current 14 under her reign, so there's a 15th to come, folks, yes. One of them actually had 2 tenures. Who was that?
Yes, good.
Who
good question.
Would you say was
yes,
that?
put it in the comments or.
Yes. So one of the prime ministers, we're counting him as we'll say the 14th, but actually had 2.
Yeah.
Two tenures.
And if you
guess.
Oh yes, I'm reading it now. Who's it?
Yeah.
They say Harold Wilson, Mark. They say that's the person.
Well, this is true. Yes, the genie of the pipe. For those who remember, he had a very good technique. I mean, look, this was the man who brought the Labour Party back to the fore. Very much a working class
brilliant
person.
Man, very intelligent.
Excellent mind. And here's the point. And here's some clue as what I personally feel, which harps back to some of his policies, which is the white heat of technology. Do you remember that? Yes, which was the idea that there was a vision of where Britain could actually pave the way to not just innovation on technology, but to be once again a leader in industry. I very much welcome the thoughts of that sort of policy again, whether that is with Rishi Sunak or whether that's Liz Truss. But nevertheless, I want to move on to one prime minister who came to our attention and took over on the 11th of May 2010. The reason I bring him up, his name being David Cameron, is he left on the 13th of July 2016. But here's where I think that the Queen could have perhaps been a bit more vocal. Why? No, not about Brexit. No, it's about independence. And as we know, that during his tenure, that could have been a constitutional crisis if Scotland had decided to go independent. Why did we not hear from the Queen? The one opportunity to actually say something.
I agree with you, because I do think the Brexit problem, which started in the 1990s with Maastricht Treaty, when the European Union, as opposed to simply being an economic area, was formed, was taking some sovereignty, and sovereignty of a nation is important to keep a hold of. So who makes the laws? That's what sovereignty is. But if you think who personally, whose sovereignty is it? It's hers that was taken away.
Yes,
the head of the government or the head of the nation. But yes, I think that's true in that she's also Queen of Scotland separately. She's Queen Elizabeth II of Britain, so Queen Elizabeth II rather of England, I should say. But Queen Elizabeth I of Scotland. There hasn't been another Queen Elizabeth of Scotland. So interesting little factoid there. But she could have stepped in there constitutionally. She had every right to step in there and say, no, you can't leave.
Yes. Well, look, I mean, David Cameron moved on and earned a lot of money on the private circuit. Well done.
Well done, Dave.
Theresa May took over, and that was an utter disaster. But we then thought it could never get any worse. But then we had somebody who was well-groomed, well-mannered, and full of integrity. No, sorry, we didn't get that person.
We
We got
got
Boris Johnson.
Yes.
And of course, as we now know, it leads up to who will be the 15th Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So as we sort of reach
Yeah.
the thoughts, Queen Elizabeth II, who I know is a lovely fan of the show. So Clergyman Peter, who do you think that she would want to be the next Prime Minister?
Well, Business and Mark, I think it would be difficult for her. But I think I don't know, judging from her reaction to people, I can see Liz Truss she might shy away from for the same reasons as my good self, and that she doesn't want a huge war, even though that would give her her own world war. She hasn't had one. And Liz Truss seems the most likely of the two of them to push for more conflict. Rishi Sunak will be of Indian origin, and of course, as a queen of during her reign, we had the British Empire was extended into India. That would be great to have an Indian subject as
Yes.
queen of her. So maybe I think she would prefer Rishi Sunak, but I disagree, Liz. I think the other Liz Truss, is the one that will win. And
Yes.
I'm overall now, I'm sort of shifting here. You heard it here first. I think I would prefer Liz Truss, and this is why. I think despite her leaning towards being a hawk on war, I think there'd be enough restraint on that to stop it, and her economic policies are better than Rishi Sunak, especially on tax.
I agree, and I think it's going to be the Lizzie show, isn't it? Let's be honest, folks. We have got Elizabeth II, and we've got another Elizabeth II, another second Elizabeth.
And so, I suppose we can conclude with that old saying, in America, it's in God we trust, and in Britain, it's in Liz we trust. So, I think maybe we should leave it there. Before I say anything even worse. So Business and Mark and Clergyman Peter just rolling up to the end of this show, but we're waiting for you to go make a comment. Go to markandpete.com and you'll find all the episodes there. Leave a comment on that one and you'll find yourself just rolling into the other one. There's so many. We've got hundreds and hundreds of episodes, and we appreciate a comment whenever you have something constructive or destructive to say. But for Mark and Pete, it's goodbye for now. Catch you next time.